If I had to write you a check for the 3 biggest mistakes you've made in business, how big would that check be? And I'll tell you my answer is around about $2 million. So the dump tax is a real tax. You know, you literally pay this money either through an opportunity cost, missing out on something you could have done, or a real cost relating to something that somebody would have known was not a fantastic idea. All right, welcome back to the Scale My Clinic podcast. I'm really excited today. We are focused on addressing the 5 top problems that property developers, and here we specifically mean general practice owners that are developing their own property asset as a part of their clinic portfolio. And we're talking about the 5 biggest mistakes they make and how to neutralize them. We've got a subject matter expert with us today, as you'd hope, to answer this. I want to welcome Ronnie Earl to the stage. Ronnie, welcome from Optima Health Group. I'd love to hear a little bit about your background, the business background. From memory, there are 5 brothers involved. So over to you, mate. Tell us a little bit about you and why everybody listening to this should be listening to you for these warnings.
Thanks, Todd. Appreciate you having us on. It's a privilege to be a part of the Scale My Clinic community. Yeah, the long story short was ultimately my father started the business 34 years ago, and we fell into the world of dentistry. He's an A-grade electrician, got a call from a local dentist, was about to go into electrical contracting, and ultimately an opportunity came up for servicing dental equipment, and no sooner had he started that, we started doing some renovations and expansions for clients, and then one by one, as the 5 boys in the family came along, the business continued to grow, and the passion and joy and interest we had around the expansions and the renovations we were doing is really what the business has grown off. We still have a small little equipment business. Dad still ticks away at today, but the rest of the 5 boys are very much focused on the design and construction of healthcare facilities. So come from the world of the background of dentistry, done a lot of dental projects, very complex compared to I'll call it a relatively straightforward healthcare facility for GPs. But ultimately, we have the fully fledged ability for building from out of the ground, and we'll take our clients on the journey from start to finish on designing and constructing a healthcare facility. So yeah, great to be here with you today, Todd.
I think that sets you guys apart in being able to take people from concept all the way through to completion, and we'll circle back to that at the end. We'll make sure that your contact details are in the show notes so people can get access to that. But let's not dither any longer. Let's get into the 5 biggest mistakes that people make. And these mistakes are going to be really costly. Before we jump into number 1, I'm going to pull out a book. I always love to have an example of a book. This one is a favorite of mine, The Road Less Stupid. And this is by Keith Cunningham. And he talks about something he calls the dumb tax. Now, the way he describes this, he says, if I had to write you a check for the 3 biggest mistakes you've made in business, how big would that check be? And you may or may not answer this, Ronnie, but I'll tell you my answer is around about $2 million. So the dump tax is a real tax. You know, you literally pay this money either through an opportunity cost, missing out on something you could have done, or a real cost relating to something that somebody would have known was not a fantastic idea. And so for me, it's a couple of $1 million. You might have to think about it a little bit. As you're thinking about it, if you know the answer, then certainly share it. But let's get into number 1. What is number 1 on the biggest mistakes?
Yeah, sure. So ultimately, there's a lot from my side of the fence to tell that the cost of lost opportunity is always a very hard one to quantify. But moving on to sort of the five biggest mistakes we see in property development when it comes to practice owners jumping into it. And before I talk through that, I do just want to cover off, I suppose, with everything we discussed today, there's no one size fits all solution. So every situation is different, and we do sort of the commercial tenancy fit out. We do building renovation or a house conversion to a commercial building, or a lot of the ground up construction, so from an empty block of land through to a finished facility. But the biggest mistake we see is taking steps without the expertise. And the way I like to explain that is we all have health issues along our journey, and as much as Dr. Google helps us from time to time, it's obviously critical we lean on the experts in every area of our life. And I think what we see is that, there's a reason for existence for everyone out there in the wild world. And so it's making sure that you speak to the right experts when you're launching into something that really does involve a lot of time and a lot of cost.
Yeah, I've got a couple of strong opinions on this, and I'll share them with you, and then I'd love to dive into what are some of the actual things that you see with it. My first opinion is that there's sometimes a lack of integrity with business owners where they want people to pay them well for the work they do. That's a pretty normal thing, right? That's not out there. But then on the other side, where the integrity falls apart is they're not willing to pay others for the work they do. That could be accountants, lawyers. It could be somebody who's doing work on the house, builders. It doesn't actually matter who it is, but they kind of, with themselves, they have an idea that they would like to occupy a premium position. But when they're purchasing service, they kind of think that they should be haggling and getting towards the cheaper end. And, as with most things in life, you pay a higher amount, you'll get a higher quality return. And so this is a really good opportunity just to share the top 2, 3, or 4 mistakes that you've come across where maybe you've had to get in and bail someone out, or their lack of expertise has got them in trouble. What are the types of issues that people get into here?
Yeah, good question, Todd. And I think there's a number we could touch on, but some of the, just the very early steps is just having this perception that a property comes up and you think, oh, the location's good, it's near X or Y or Z, and just jumping into it without actually having a stop and thinking about what you're actually trying to achieve here. It's either committing to a big lease, which ultimately goes on as a liability on the balance sheet, or it's a big loan to take on the property, or investing a lot of cash. So it's right back at the start, actually understanding what you're even trying to achieve. And there's a number of other mistakes which we'll cover off in more detail as we go through the process. But just on your point around what you pay, getting for what you pay for, ultimately there is a bit of misconception out there around numbers, because you always hear what someone else has done, and it might have been back in 1997, and today it's 2025. So there's a lot of challenges when it comes to construction and trying to work out what costs are. But that's, again, the purpose of taking steps without the expertise is do that work up front. So when you do take the step, you're armed and you're aware, and we'll cover off on that in more detail, but you know what the big picture looks like.
Yeah, I think you're right, Ronnie. I mean, imagine going to your staff and saying, hey, listen, do you mind if I take your pay back to the level 6 years ago? Or going down to your local car dealership and say, I really would like one of these. I noticed that the price 6 years ago was this. That's what I want to pay. That's actually ridiculous. And as you say, quite dangerous, having a lot of assumptions from there. Just on this one area of the lack of expertise, it sort of fits nicely into something called the Johari window, where we have the awareness of the problems. And Donald Rumsfeld once famously was talking about this. These are sort of the unknown unknowns. What are the things that I'm not aware that I don't know? And there's usually a couple of known unknowns, some things that you don't know that you want to get covered off on. And again, I'm going to go back to Keith Cunningham. He's got a really good framework for this, which is super easy to remember, which is why I'm going to talk about it now. 4 questions you need to ask yourself with any big decision, any big project. Number 1, what's the upside? Entrepreneurs are awesome at that. We always look at how could it go well, which is sort of what you're talking about. That's usually how you get yourself in trouble, though, because unadulterated hubris will get people into lots of trouble. So what's the upside is number 1. That's easy. Number 2, what's the downside? This needs a fair bit of work. There's always risks, and that's what you're saying. Because your expertise, 34 years of the family in there, multiply that by 4 other siblings, and you've got a lot of on-the-ground experience that you can share and knowledge. So number 1, what's the upside? Number 2, what's the downside? Number 3, can I live with the downside? In the case of what you're talking about, having committed loans, having committed resources, the answer may be I can't live with the downside if it eventuates, because I'm going to be left with a lemon that I can't use in the right way. And so sometimes paying for advice and getting advice that may be, I'm going to say, reassuringly expensive. Good advice is reassuringly expensive. And then you walk away. That is also valuable, because saving you from making a big mistake is a huge one. So what's the upside? What's the downside? Can I live with the downside? Number 4, what is it I don't know? By definition, you cannot answer that question yourself. You must get a subject matter expert in, and probably more than one. That would include someone like you, Ronnie, often your accountant, often somebody who's looking at brokering your finance, and maybe a lawyer as well. So that would be a group of professionals. Is there anybody else we should add to that advisory group that you think?
Yeah, it's a good point. It does depend on what you're looking to do, obviously, Todd. So, I think initially those 4 sort of areas you cover off on would be sufficient. One thing is that we don't know what we don't know, and we're always happy to bring other experts to the table in terms of if there's something that we don't feel comfortable with, or we'd just like to have another layer of advice there. We're more than happy to bring, join the dots at the table to get the best outcome for our clients. So I think initially those 4 key areas is what I would suggest, but different situations bring different needs.
Awesome. Okay, so we've got number one tied down. Let's get to number two.
Yes, number two is just a lack of due diligence, which does tie into number one, obviously, because you haven't got the experts in the corner. But when it comes to buying a property, there's obviously, or leasing a property, there's so much to consider. But just to touch on some of the obvious ones, you might pick up the phone and ring the council, and you get this junior duty planner. He says, it should be all good. It's in this zone. Happy days, and away you go. And little do they know you're putting $2 million of your hard-earned money on the line. And so ultimately, then where that lack of due diligence falls over is that when clients come to us and say, hey, I've just bought this property, or I've just committed to a lease on this property, it's going to be great, I'm going to put 10 consult rooms, and it's going to be this, that, and the other thing. And then we do our due diligence and come and say, that's not going to work because it's actually, we're not going to provide sufficient parking, or there's a building and works overlay that, building a one-story building here is just not going to cut it. They want to see at least 4 stories, and they've got an overlay that controls that. There's obviously multiple different scenarios we can talk through. And then there's issues just like even on a title. We've had developments where, the planning's great, but on the title there's a covenant that restricts that property purely for residential purposes. And so then you've got to go through the long-winded process of removing a covenant, which in some cases, don't get me wrong, you do that due diligence up front and you look at it and go, well, on the percentages of probability, it's actually worth undertaking. But when you jump into it knowing what the risk is, it's part of what you covered off on earlier. It's a very different story to jumping into something without knowing what the risk is. So that's where the big trips we see is in that lack of due diligence. And again, there's a lot of different property types to speak to, but that's some sort of high-level summary.
I think the reality is that when you find out something like that increases the risk of the deal, there should be a repricing of the deal to adjust for that risk. And so it doesn't mean that you wouldn't necessarily go ahead with something, but you might have some other counterbalancing parts of the agreement.
Exactly, and it's can you live with it? There's always risk in everything we do. We open the front door and open the car. It's a risk we take, but being aware of it, being educated, and then can I live with it? Worst case scenario, you're buying a good property. If it all falls over, you can sell it again and get your money back, or whatever the situation. But can you live with it is exactly the point.
Awesome. Hey, I'll share with you a story that illustrates this point really well, which is personal. So in the building I'm in now in Spotswood, when we first went to construct the building, we didn't end up owning it at the end of it just because of the way that we arranged it. During that time, it was post GFC, difficult to get finance for things. And I went with my architect to the head of planning at the local council, which in my case is Hobson's Bay. And so that's in the inner west in Melbourne. We go down there. We've got a 2-story building. The general practice is on the second floor. Bottom floor has all the ancillary services. And the head of planning is a Canadian guy. And he says, well, in behind this, so we're right adjacent to a railway station. Behind is some factories and other designs. And he said, we'd really like this to be a 3-story building because we want it to conceal some of the stuff behind there. We go out of there and the architect says to me, I've never been to a meeting like that where they've said, add another story. We want it to be bigger. And they were really amenable. And I said, okay, well, that's pretty weird. So we go away, we redraw everything, and then we come back. Now, we come back to the same council, but the councillors had a shuffle of heads of department, which they do semi-regularly. We sit down in front of the new head of planning, and I kid you not, this is the conversation. We said, we've adjusted them on the basis of the last meeting, and the guy says, not bad. You reckon you can make it 2 stories? and so, it was basically like that comedy, that utopia, where the council is just a bunch of absolute clowns. And that was exactly what happened. So meanwhile, 6 to 8 weeks had passed. You get time in, holding costs rack up. We paid to draft new drawings, come in with them. But that's exactly the type of thing you're talking about. In that case, I had the expert there. We were doing appropriate due diligence. It was the head of the department. But even then, you sometimes still get led up the garden path. And it was a really eye-opening experience for me just to think that is unbelievably mind-blowingly underwhelming.
Yeah, it's frustrating. It doesn't surprise me in the least, unfortunately. The worst bit is nothing to hold them to account. The residents have got to pay our bills, and if we can't, we're held to account. So it's frustrating. But even that sort of is a bit of a lesson in itself in terms of having sort of preliminary discussions with council and so on. Sometimes can be a bit of a waste of time. So again, depending on the situation, the scenario, sometimes you're actually better off sticking purely to policy or knowing where you can bend the rules a little bit, push the boundaries, and then you go into a full application and actually nut it out right there and then, rather than going through the pre-app conversations and do this, do that, and then you still get back to ground zero. But again, I don't know the detail of that discussion, but that's where there can be some challenges for the practice owner if they're trying to take this on themselves. You pick it up 12 months later and they're still going round in circles, and it's just frustrating.
Yeah. 100%. And then the one thing I learned from this is never to attend any council meetings. So that was the last meeting I attended. I just thought, I can't do this. It's not good for my mental health. It's probably not good for me because I actually don't understand things that don't follow logic. And so I was like, this is just going to make me behave in a manner which I regret. So I'm out.
Yeah,
all right.
It does come back to that lack of due diligence, Todd. Like, just on that point, is that like sometimes you buy a property knowing what the risks are in terms of you might undertake it. But obviously, just being able to be aware that some people say, councils are just so hard, so difficult. But at the end of the day, generally speaking, there's planning policy there for a reason. If you play within the framework of that, and sometimes in Victoria, for example, depending on the size of it, you can actually get a complying development built out of the ground without even needing a planning permit. So I guess I'm trying to say, part of that due diligence is making sure that, at least you know what the worst case scenario outcome might be, even if you are trying to push the boundaries a little bit.
Yeah. No, that's great advice. And that brings us to a nice little soft end on number 2, lack of due diligence. Let's jump into number 3. What is the third of the 5 biggest mistakes people make?
Yeah, so the other big one we see is just not planning ahead. As we know, time and tide waits for no man, and unfortunately, these things do take time, just like you commented on in your experience there, and that extra 8 weeks plus that it added to the program. And often we get clients that reach out and it's, I've got 6 months to go on the lease or 12 months to go on the lease, and hey, I'm going to plan to do this. And so, well, that's how long the due diligence period is going to take, or not quite, but the planning process, that alone, construction. So it's very much about thinking about it 3, 4, 5 years out, so you can actually plan accordingly. And it might even be that you, from a want perspective, that's what you want to achieve. But when you're planning it so far out, you can do the financial forecasting, and you might say, it's not going to work in that time period. Let's push it out another 5 years. But it's never too early to start the discussion. And we always say that it's just have that conversation. It's also sometimes you might have a preconceived idea that this is the only option for you to take to the next step or to move your facility to. But when you have some other thoughts at the table and you can round table it and actually thrash out what does the future look like for you, then we can throw different ideas at you. Hadn't thought about that. So it's just that early planning and having those conversations early, so you can A, plan time, but B, plan where are we actually going with all of this, and not putting yourself under pressure.
I'm just going to repeat 2 things I heard you say, which I think are really important for people to absorb. The first thing is that it takes longer than you think. So you mentioned 3, 4, 5 years. People are often signing 3-year or 5-year terms and then thinking, I'll focus on this towards the end of that term. What you're saying is have a conversation early, because all of the work that needs to be done, including the building and the fit out, etc., is probably going to take something like that. And let's pretend people finish early. Like, let's pretend something magical happens and the council is super accommodating. Town planning goes beautifully, construction goes beautifully, and you build it early. How do people address the fact that they've got a brand new facility and one that they've maybe leased that might have 12, 18 months, 2 years to go on it?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So there's 2 parts. Where time often gets lost is actually getting to construction. And the reason for that is often it's obviously about the client and your availability to make decisions through that process. Then there's the council and the third-party authority requirements you've got to tick off, and they can be obviously quite a frustration at times. But once you get through that journey, if we say, look, actually we're tracking 6 months out of schedule or 12 months out of schedule at this stage, there's nothing saying you can't pause construction. Wait 6 months or whatever it looks like. Because when it's at construction, we're in complete control. And yes, there's always, there can always be site risk that could have an issue on site, or just weather, depending on the time of the year you're trying to get it underground, etc. But the reality of it is that largely is set and forget for us. We're in control. We can deliver on what we say we're going to do. So we can always pause before we get started in that period. You can never speed that up. So you can never get there and suddenly turn a 9-month program into a 3-month build or whatever, or even a fit out. You need to turn it from a 10-week fit out into a 6-week fit out. There's always there's that side to it. What was the first part of your question then, Todd? There was something else.
So the first part I was talking about was when you get to say everything goes really well. So the voice inside an owner's head when they're listening to this is often they're not sure that it takes that long. So most people think, I'm going to sign a 3-year option term or a 5-year option term, and then I'll start looking at my own property towards the end of it. What that actually ends up creating is them agreeing to another term in most cases because they just can't get it done in time. But then the other side of it, which is probably their fear, is what if I have two things available? I can't afford both. I've got a rental property and I've got a new development coming on, which is increasing my costs. I can't be in two places at once. One of the things you said is you can slow down construction. You can slow it down, but what you can't do is you can't speed it up. So you can't make that 3-year process 6 months or 12 months, no matter how much money you've got, because you've got to book things, you've got to get materials in, all that stuff just takes time. Is there anything else people need to be doing or thinking about in that time?
Just like you mentioned, you might have a 3 or 5 year term. So you say, if you start the conversation, it's not necessarily buying a property or committing to the next property 3 or 5 years out. It's more knowing very clearly what the options are and taking the time to explore that. For example, in metro areas where it might be more challenging and more expensive to buy a property, it might be that leasing is really the only option for you. And maybe it is looking at going, well, let's do our due diligence around the area and see what options come up over this time period. And it might just prove to you that staying where you are is really the best option. So it's not necessarily about sort of taking on too many apples at the same time. It's literally more about having the conversation about what the possibilities are of the future. And then if something makes sense and it looks like the right pathway to go down, it's then plotting that out in sensible timeframes, which may still include an extension to the lease, and it might be having an early discussion with the landlord that, look, we want to add another 12 months or 2 years now because that's what it's going to take or whatever. So,
yep. And I think the other thing for people to think about that are listening is there are creative ways of addressing this. So, for example, if you need to exit a lease early, you can negotiate that. I've had a circumstance where I've been chatting to an owner who couldn't control the time frame. It was 18 months or 2 years where they had both, the new one and the old one that was a rental, and they've been able to sublet that with the permission of the landlord, get somebody in there. Even if it's not quite covering the whole rent, it's going to make a substantial difference to the holding costs of both. And so the key thing here is that it's pretty rare you can line things up beautifully. So in people's heads, they often have optimized outcomes, which is, I'm going to finish the lease here and then I have 2 weeks where I can get into the new one. That's unlikely to be the case, but that's okay. You can manage all of the different scenarios in a variety of ways. And that's about talking to experts, people like you on the property side. And that's the sort of work we do with owners on the owner side of things. All right, I think that covers off on number 3. Was there anything else you wanted to add to lack of plan?
Quickly chuck in there, Todd, the other thing is sometimes practice owners are very scared and understandably scared of someone coming in and using their facility if they don't have a make good clause at the end of the lease. So they feel like someone could come in and take over their patient base if they ask them moving around the corner or down the road or whatever it looks like. So actually planning that 6-month period where it's not great for cash flow, but it might be that transition period where you do have to both, but it's strategically so that you can transition out of one into the other, and then whatever happens down the track, your patients are now used to going to this new space. So
I'll share a story from GP owner that I had when I was a junior doctor, and I won't name him. He's a migrant doctor, a fabulous guy, and we were chatting about this, relocating the practice, and he said, Todd, there's 3 different types of patients, and I just want to be really clear, he didn't mean this disrespectfully. He said there's dogs, and he said 25% of the patients are like dogs. They'll follow the master wherever the master goes, meaning the doctor. The second group are cats. The 25% are the cats, and they'll stay with the house, whoever feeds them. And then he said the third group are the rats. That's 50%, and they'll go anywhere. And so I just thought that was kind of an elegant, not necessarily eloquent, but a description of kind of the things that happen afterwards. And we can assume that if you're building your own premises, it's a better amenity, better facility, probably larger, certainly newer. Like it should be better. And we'll go through this in a little bit of time. But I think you're right. Killing the old location, if you can, that might only be as little as 4 to 6 weeks of inactivity there. And then if you have to make good, pull out the fit out. That's one way. I did know of a dentistry group that used to put concrete in the plumbing after exiting these premises, just as an aside, Ronnie.
Yeah, no, there's plenty of that goes on. So
all right, let's move gears. We're in 3rd gear at the moment. We've done lack of planning. What is number 4?
So the 4th one is not knowing your numbers. So really something that's very important is starting out with the end in mind. So looking at what you're trying to achieve, and this is the whole purpose of those early discussions, is where are we trying to go with this? What's the end game we're looking at, and what's the cost of achieving that? And so it's really about not underestimating the overall cost. Typically in life, unfortunately, a lot of the budgets we set ourselves are often way too low. And ultimately we get a shock at the end. I think the point is it's better to have, if it comes as a shock, it's better to have it at the start where you can either plan around and go, look, that's not an option for me because I've got X, Y, and Z going on in my life or outside of the medical business. So that's not an option. Let's look at option B and C. But it's really starting out knowing what that looks like. And we hear some horror stories, and we do pick up the pieces here where because we offer a design and construct service, we're able to give a firm number back at the start before clients even spend a single cent on our services or be a property. But a lot of people spend a lot of money with architecture firms and get it all designed up, and architects, as we call them, sometimes they design exactly how they want to see it, and don't speak disparagingly of them, but ultimately there's no value management, there's no real understanding of what the final costs are going to be. So ultimately, it's not to spend all that money to find out, wow, this is substantially over budget. And there's been plenty of projects that we've come in at that point and then sort of value managed, redesigned, and actually delivered a project substantially less in overall cost. And so it's just, starting out on that journey, knowing what the overall number is going to be and making sure it makes sense before you start engaging this, that, and the other thing. You're aware of what that looks like.
Yeah, I like this. There's two things here that I'd like to just tease apart, if I may. Number one is, as somebody who coaches general practice owners, and I work with a lot of other business people in the groups that I receive coaching, expertise, and advice from, the singular difference between successful and less successful people is knowing your numbers. You will find people that are successful in business can reel off all of the key numbers, and they don't say things like, in our case, often people say, oh, that's in Cubico. That's the most commonly used dashboard. But they don't say, I know that number, it's there, because that would be like on the freeway, the police officer saying to you, do you know you were speeding? And you say, I know the number, it's on my dashboard. That's not going to be a defense. You need to actually know the numbers. And so I think you're right. Knowing your numbers is super, super critical for your own business as well as the project. And like you said, entrepreneurs have a bias towards hopefulness and optimism. And so that can mean that we actually don't include everything. And so I think that's a really, really important one. I might add one more thing here, and I'm really keen on your view here. I am not a fan of people, this is with rare exception, and obviously there's a little asterisk that says there are always exceptions to the rule, and this is not advice, it is general commentary. I don't love people starting their first clinic as the one that they own, for two reasons. One is, when you start a business, that's a certain risk. There's operational risk, there's execution risk, recruitment risk. There's a lot of stuff you've got to do with starting a business up. And when you first start, really know how big your business is going to become. The community, I think, determines how big your business will be. That doesn't matter if you're a fast food place, furniture shop, or a general practice. How many people love what you do ultimately determines the size of the business. JB Hi-Fi started as one store. Bunnings started as one store. All these things started and people said, actually, we'd like more of that. So you don't know that until you open up and that you get your business running. I love a startup to be lean and small. And so that usually means rented. And so rental options are often 3 years or 5 years. I think the time to think about building a clinic is probably somewhere between 6 and 10 years into your business in general practice, because you're going to have a fair idea of the kind of terminal size of your business. How many rooms do I need? What other services do people want? What type of locations locally are available for this? How much parking do I need? What amenity? What's going to be co-located? Pathology, pharmacy, imaging, allied health, all of the other things, non-GP specialists, all those things are really important to know. And provided you're offering a bigger amenity, you might have some flexibility in choosing slightly different zoning that's favorable, and just knowing as how big your patient audience is, what your revenue is, and what your profitability is, makes planning a whole lot easier. I'm really keen to test that with you, because what I think this is like, Ronnie, it's like those, I've had friends like this, that they buy a house and they kind of do a redesign and improvement to the house, but they're only thinking 3 to 5 years ahead. Next thing you know, they're knocking down parts of it again and doing it again. And you just think, God, if you just had done a little bit of thinking about what the needs were and got some professional advice, you wouldn't have to do this 2 or 3 times. You just do it once and do it properly. And this is kind of what I think is the case with people starting a business. Just get good at that, understand what their end size will be, and then you can make a bigger investment in what's likely to be a future wealth creation strategy. Where does that sit with your bias and preferences and experience?
Yeah, fully agree, Todd. It's something that when I say that, there is the flip side to it where you get someone that's trying to set up in the most expensive shopping centre and in the prime location, they're paying $200,000 a year in rent, and they have forced into a 7-year lease, and ultimately they've committed to a $1.4 million liability, really, which is no different to potentially buying a property or building a property or whatever that looks like. So again, there's that toss of the coin, which would make more sense potentially to own something and pay it off that way. But generally speaking, startups aren't going to do that. And so, yes, fully agree that starting out with something that is much more affordable, both on rent and fit out costs, something that's, it comes back to the right site selection, having the advice around that to get a more cost effective fit out setup so that you can, get your returns in 3 to 5 years and have those further options to extend if you need to. But absolutely, it's about sometimes, same with us in our business, you sort of start out in a journey and you think you're doing this and then you head down a different pathway and it takes time to evolve. And ultimately, I think you don't really know what your end game looks like at the start, obviously. So fully agree that going through the exercise and the challenge of running a business, and it also helps to work out have you got the appetite for taking on bigger risk because you've been through the process of starting your own practice. And so there's certainly agree with that bias, Todd, but then there's also the flip side of, okay, if you do choose to do a bigger development or even move to a bigger lease site, but there might be an opportunity to create more of a health hub, for example, where if you do own the facility, you've obviously got that opportunity to create, as you said, it's a wealth creation tool, create other income streams. But you're doing that, A, with a lot more experience behind you, but B, you've probably built up a lot of connections and a lot of opportunity in your time in starting the business. So, I think there's always the flip of the coin that says you could do it the other way, but generally speaking, we fully agree with what you've put forward.
And look, Ronnie, the worst thing is that person would own a property asset. My biggest issue with it is generally when people build their first practice, it's often, say, 4, 5, maybe 6 rooms, relatively small. That can work like fleet training. So what happens is the size of that container caps the future size of the business. If people don't think, I don't have to stay here, I can move out, that can become allied health or something else, I can hold that asset and move on. What I find is people often become attached to the business and that property being combined, and it prevents them thinking creatively about what they could do. And flea training is, you put a flea inside a jar, put a lid on it, the flea bounces against the lid, and then after a period of time, it learns that the lid's there. You take the lid off, the flea won't jump out because it believes that the lid is still there. It'll stay in the jar despite that having no top on it. And the same thing happens to clinics that are small with owners that kind of have bound the practice and the location rather than thinking, okay, this is just the beginning, I can certainly expand this. And it's not like that's a big problem owning a property asset. So I just want to be completely clear on that.
No, it's really good. I love that analogy because often we talk about that. I can't remember who actually came up with the quote, but we create the space and then the space creates us. And it's often a challenge trying to get practice owners to think outside of the 4 walls they're used to and see the opportunity with. Doesn't necessarily mean it's got to be bigger, but it might be more efficient, might be more organised, might be a more effective layout, or whatever it is. But often, we get sort of created by the space and stuck in those 4 walls.
Yeah, I think that's the other thing that's really important here is you're going to learn a lot from using a space that a lot of it can't be foreseen because everyone's going to use a space slightly differently. You want to reinvest that learning in the next location. My rule for relocating was that it had to be a net positive on the patient experience, the employee experience, and the GP experience. And it could be neutral on any one of those 3 and positive on 2. But if it was ever a negative on one of those 3, then you should reevaluate that's probably not the right decision. I had a conversation with a guy who owned a famous hi-fi business in Australia. This is a high-end hi-fi business. And they used to have a main street location and it was really busy, good foot traffic and massive rent, really high rent. They didn't own the place. He made a decision that he would move it to a secondary location, but the amount he saved on rent, he was going to commit to marketing budget. He was happy to spend it, but he decided it was just going up and really it was a substantial amount of turnover. So he decided to repurpose that and his business exploded. It absolutely went crazy. And so I think it's a good reminder about, I have this notion that practices are like planets. So the bigger the practice, the bigger the planet, the bigger the gravitational pull. So provided you move people, if you've got better patient amenity, better amenity for your staff, better amenity for your GP. So say you're a plus on all of those, then people are going to move with you because you've got a large gravitational pull, provided you don't move 15 kilometres away. But if you move 3, 5, sometimes even more away, but the clinic has a great reputation, it's a decent size, then people will follow you to that new location. And that just gives a bit of flexibility as to where people might choose to relocate their practices. Do you think that's a binding concern, that people often want to move a practice in a very limited sort of distance from their current premises?
Yeah, there can be an emotional attachment to it, and it's often something we do have to overcome, and there's plenty of stats and data we've got from successful clients that have done it. But you're dead right, like we focus on patient experience, practice efficiency and staff satisfaction. If those three things are nailed, then generally speaking, the dollars will follow. But yeah, I love that story you just told, because ultimately, you think the location's everything, but that experience you had where it moved from somewhere where you're paying stupid rent, and ultimately 50% of what you save against marketing, and you could still triple your business. So it's something that it does take courage, obviously, but again, it comes back to that early discussion and actually planning it out with time rather than making rush decisions and emotional decisions. And I do want to make it very clear that we firmly believe in not moving for moving's sake. It's not about that. It's actually about planning for the future, and it's got to align with business goals and aspirations. So,
absolutely. I think we shouldn't forget that location was made up by real estate agents, and that's to sell more property. So we should keep that in the back of our mind. All right, I think we're finished with number 4, knowing your numbers. And if you're listening to this and you don't know your numbers, you should be ashamed. Go and actually make sure you know your numbers. And if you need someone to kick your ass, then message me, jump into Project X, and we'll do that. All right. Number 5. Let's get to number 5. What is the 5th area that prospective property developers for general practices should be thinking about?
Yeah, so it's probably something that happens far too often without a lot of thought and realisation, but ultimately it's taking the risk on yourself. And what we mean by that is coming back to sort of where we started off in terms of taking steps without the expertise, is that ultimately if I've got a health issue and I sort of try and use Dr. Google and self-diagnose what's wrong with me, and sort of it all goes to worst case scenario, there's not a lot of opportunity to correct it when I get there. But obviously having the right people in the corner is, for you as the property developer, there's always risk in terms of, might hit rock on site or whatever that situation is. Every property and development's different. But outside of that, and even still a large component of that, the risk should be on who you've got in your corner. So that's why there's the importance of having the runs on board experience and someone that you've got that relationship and trust with, that genuinely can take the responsibility for the development. But the other one to that is, we see those horror stories on the internet with builders going broke, and largely it's some poor young couple that have saved up their life earnings to put a deposit on a house, and all of a sudden that builder's gone and their money's gone and they're back to ground zero. And it's not to be negative about that, but it's very important that, again, removing the risk from yourself is that there's runs on the board experience, and there's that opportunity to even talk to your financier and accountant of these guys, how long they've been around for, can we trust them? Because you spoke earlier about what you pay for. There's always going to be something cheaper, but it's what's missing, and that's where it's really critical that you do have the right people in your corner, so that ultimately the risk is really on them. I actually had a practice owner say to me recently about a project. He said, "No, that's for you guys to do, because then if there's a mistake, it's your problem." I really love, because ultimately that's what we're here for. So that sort of summarised, and it was good to be told that by a client instead of me saying it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the thing to think about here, there's one favourite saying of mine, which is, if you think experts are expensive, you wait until you try amateurs. And that is a universal truth. But risk is mitigated by knowledge and experience. And the problem with things like this is, with rare exception, you won't accumulate enough knowledge and experience to become an expert as a property owner. You need to be somebody in that business. And sometimes people will be cruel about one-trick ponies, but I love a one-trick pony when all they've done for 34 years is one trick, because they're just going to know, they're going to have forgotten more things than you learn. And the knowledge accumulated in that time, which is organizational knowledge, it's a sum total of all the people. One benefit of being in a family business, it's like the mob. Nobody can leave. That knowledge is retained. And I think that's really important, because, again, it's that Johari window. The things that you don't know are likely to hurt you. I think it's a really good phrase about holding too much risk. You need to lay that off. And the example I gave earlier about showing up to things that I shouldn't have been at. It was a good example of how that wasn't the best use of my time. It wasn't the best use of my attention and focus. I should have been doing the things that only I can do. And then that should have been the focus of the experts. And so I think this is a really important area to understand. Maybe if you could walk through a couple of areas where you see this kind of playing out in a substantially negative way.
Yeah, it's trying to think of some scenarios that we've sort of come across. I think the biggest one is really the obvious one is the time, right? So you've got a business to run and you're putting all your time and effort into something that really isn't your profit generator. It's really either a wealth creation tool or it's a lever to get you that profit because you need a facility to work from. And so there's the cost of lost opportunity while you're trying to put your time and effort into something that you really don't know what you don't know. Whereas on the other side to it, there's trying to get some developments where clients have jumped in and taken steps themselves and even purchased properties and then done some designs and got permits and then they've got a certain way down the track and then realised that it's just not going to work because of one thing or the other. And ultimately, there's no one to point the finger at, especially if you're trying to manage trades and do it all yourself or whatever. Ultimately, you're just putting yourself in the gun. And really, I suppose the difference with us is that we know that if we do a bad job by a client, there's not a lot of future for our business. And so there's always that emotional commitment to our client that we've got to do the right thing by them. Yes, you've got to have things in writing and things have got to be agreeable and it's all got to stack up. But ultimately, trying to manage a trade that really doesn't care if they don't do another medical practice fit out, for example, it obviously puts you in a very vulnerable position. And there's a lot of scenarios that we see that are really unfortunate and sad and opportunities where we might have put forward something to the client and then they've gone their own way, which is absolutely their right. But it's sometimes you can't measure the cost. Sometimes it's really, really obvious the cost. So there's a lot of different tripping hazards out there.
Absolutely. And so you might not be aware of this data. The RACGP every year does a report called the Health of the Nation. In the last 6 years, we've seen this incredible trend in regard to ownership from GPs that have graduated, and so they're fellows. It used to be, if we go back to about 2000, it used to be that around about 55% of owners thought, you know what, I might get into practice ownership. Now it's 20%, and it is split evenly between maybe and yes. So only 10% of current graduates from general practice training are thinking, so that's the RACGP and ACRM, are thinking they might own practices. And so this is a bit of an opportunity for you to make a pitch to them, because I think it's really important that people understand the caveat here is that this is not personal or specific advice. It's general advice, and take advice from your experts. So that's the kind of obvious large print here as well as the small print. However, owning a practice and owning a property are substantial wealth creation vehicles that you can accumulate substantial wealth over, say, 10, 15, 20, sometimes 30, sometimes 40 years in the business. I might get you to talk to that. So if you're talking to a junior doctor who's just graduated and they're in that 10% that are thinking, oh, maybe I'm in, maybe I'm out, perhaps that's a couple of examples that come to mind about something really awesome that somebody created that was beneficial to the community, to the team, as well as to themselves, or a couple of pearls that you would like to share with that young GP.
Yeah, very good question. So I think first and foremost, Todd, is probably for someone that's looking to jump into that ownership space. When it comes to the business side of things, that's probably where we very much point back to the right experts at the table, and that's throwing to someone like yourself or whoever it might be that can advise and help with that. I think if you don't have the appetite for it, hungry for it, then, and we've had plenty of scenarios where clients have said, look, we're looking to start this business and this is going to be great. And just through the course of the conversation, we get a bit of a vibe that really you're not quite ready for it. And we're not afraid to say that. We prefer to say it and put a word of warning out there rather than not say anything and then see them fail. So I think that's the first thing is the appetite for it and having the right people in the corner, like we talked about earlier, advice and speaking with other experts out there or maybe other practice owners you're working for, that you've got a relationship with to talk through what's actually involved with it and sort of almost have a go at running the business without being the business owner. But then on the flip side, we have seen those that are committed to it and sort of have structured their life, their goals around this sort of grand plan. And I think obviously it's never too early to start in some regards, as long as you're set up right from the start. And we've seen some practices in different modalities. Amazing, someone that's committed themselves to it from a young age, and just to see the growth of what they've achieved. And then more than just the dollars and cents, right? It's the life, the flexibility and the autonomy they have in their lives. So I think it's to any young practice owner out there that's considering it, is to speak to your network, speak to the experts in the field, have those conversations. Someone like ourselves will be part of, that number. What do the numbers look like? What are the options? Looking at the big picture before you actually sort of commit, because you don't want to emotionally commit and then find that it's all too hard. And then, if you're in, make sure you're in, because obviously there's great opportunity. And then I think what you talked about in terms of how you start out versus what the end game could be, we know it's a long journey. So don't think you're going to suddenly jump in and be at the finish line. It's obviously working through you can't skip your grades essentially, can you?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to look at the trajectories of careers and investments. And so sometimes you'll see two people that literally look like superficially they're doing similar things, running a business of a similar size, but one's invested in the property, one's decided to rent for the whole time, one's decided to grow that. Ostensibly they start with the same opportunities and the same resources. It really comes back to resourcefulness and making sure that they're investing in getting good advisors. And I think one of the things that people need to do early on in their journey as a professional of any sort is to recruit a good team of advisors around them. Make sure they've got the right people in their corner. I think, my philosophy is pay them well, because you want them to pick the phone up when you call them and think, oh, I really like talking to Ronnie because I know that he and I kind of understand the problem from the same perspective, or he'll challenge me, or whatever that might be. You want to have people that you know well, and you don't need to recruit new people all the time, because you're kind of having problems and you're shopping at the bargain end of things. Usually that means you're turning people over because things don't work out as you like. There's problems along the way. Promises are made and not followed through on. And so I think this is an important kind of mindset to take into this area. Keen to get one last thought from you as to doctors that are at the stage that they are thinking they want to do this. What do they need to be doing rather than the junior person? What's a doctor who's thinking, you know what, I'm ready to go on, and maybe they're already a practice owner, I'm ready to go and own my own property. What's the first step for them? First 1, 2, 3 things they need to be doing.
Yeah, good. Todd, I was worried I might have misunderstood your first question, so that's good. Ultimately, from this stage, someone that's running a practice, doing well, obviously everything's humming along. Obviously you've got your challenges, but obviously in terms of taking that next step into wealth creation, I think there's a couple of things. So first and foremost, so it comes back to the numbers. What are you paying in rent? Can you continue to grow where you are? If you hit that ceiling, you need to move anyway. And then it's a case of, sometimes it's really, really obvious in terms of someone that's paying X amount of rent. For the cost of development, they're going to be paying off their own asset for the next 15, 30 years, however you want to structure that up. And ultimately, you've got a facility to leave there. I think really the steps are start the conversation now, not when you're getting to a point of bursting at the seams. So having that conversation early, looking at all those options, and then bringing the different experts to the table, getting your financier and your accountant to plan out what that looks like. And then it's really about looking for the right property, and that right property is very much a case-by-case scenario. And as I said earlier, there's no one-size-fits-all solution. So it's very tough to sort of try and speak to what the ideal outcome could look like. But it's really about taking the time to analyse that for your situation, depending on where you're located, out regional where land's a bit more cheaper, or maybe in a metro area where it's better to use a super fund and buy an existing building, or whatever that looks like. So I think the key message would be to start the conversation now, rather than when it feels right to start talking about it, it's almost too late. You're sort of too far, you're left too short, and then you're going to have to extend where you are, or whatever. You're forced to make rush decisions. So,
yeah, I think a good sort of way of thinking about this is, if things are easy to do, so a conversation's really easy to have. If it's easy to do, it's easy not to do. So you've just got to make sure that you commit to it, you follow through, begin those conversations, and then, as you say, run them to ground. If it turns out that's not the right choice, completely okay. But if it is, or it's conditional, then you can start to work towards that. Ronnie, that's a great place to bring this episode to a close. Anybody who's listening to this and has some feedback, drop it in the comments below, wherever you're finding this. If there's something else you would like us to explore with Ronnie and the team at Optima Health Group, then let us know. Drop that in the notes. We'll make sure that there's some contact details. If you want to get a hold of Ronnie, he's not too hard to find on social media. But otherwise, Ronnie, I greatly appreciate your time, your contribution, your wisdom, and have a great day. For the rest of you, we'll see you on the next podcast with Scale My Clinic. Bye.
Thanks, Todd.